It was a terrible night in July. The temperature hovered around 85 degrees, and I was sweating through it. The badge on my shirt said, County Sheriff. I was one for almost 20 years. I don't usually get called at 3 a.m., but when it gets hot, temperaments flare up, and sometimes one of our respected citizens gets the brilliant idea to drink too much and offend his wife. Two of my guys answered the call. When they got there, the idiot decided to add another 10 years to his sentence by shooting them. That's when they called me. Red and blue flashing lights illuminated the area, if you can call it that, a collection of dilapidated mobile homes. The gunner's house was mostly rust-colored, with panels falling off. There was no air conditioner in sight, which may have explained his behavior. We've been thinking about adding a lot of extra ventilation to his pathetic little hot air box, just to lure the critter out. But killing innocent bystanders doesn't sit well with voters, and our 9mm bullets would go through his place and a couple of neighboring ones. Besides, the idiot's wife was there, and she didn't give us convincing evidence that we should remove her from the gene pool, even if excluding her husband would benefit humanity. So we just sat there in the heat, listening to the grasshoppers and loud screams inside. I guess the guy regretted shooting at us. In fact, I think he regretted opening his third bottle of Jack at all. I sighed and said, "We'll be here forever unless I do something." I looked at both of my guys and said, "Do you care that he shot you?" They both shook their heads no. So I took a deep breath and stood up. The shot whistled over my head. I shouted, "If you come out right now, Melvin, we will not charge you with shooting at us. If you fire one more shot, you will do hard labor for 10 years. If you hit me, it will be life. So, how do you decide? You have 10 seconds to think." There was a pause. Then the trailer door opened and Melvin walked out, bloodshot eyes, unshaven, and wearing a tattered alcoholic tank top. He held his hands up. I said, "Smart move, mate." Then I grabbed him and handcuffed him. God, how he stank. I handed it to two patrolmen, and they tossed it, none too gently, into the back of their cruiser. I said wearily, "You two take your wife's statement and then conclude it." They were on duty. I'm not. I got into my cruiser and headed back down Wisconsin 121. It was damn night, and I wanted to get a couple more hours of sleep before the sun came up. Geographically, Wisconsin lies between the Great Western Prairie, Canada's frozen north, and the dynamic melting pot of the Great Lakes, so the weather here can be really wild. The entire state was plunged into a long stretch of hot summer days, and we locals knew what that meant. It's going to be crazy when the weather changes. My luck was such that the devil decided that the account was overdue. All my senses told me a storm was coming: sight, smell, touch, and hearing. The hot, humid wind intensified. The fast-moving air was electrified. I thought to myself, great, Armageddon. The trailer park was located outside of Perkinstown, so my route led through the densely forested State Plain Nature Park. I had just pulled out onto the bridge over the Chequamegon waters when the storm, which was just a flicker of lightning in the distance, arrived with fury. There's nothing like being on a bridge over dark water in the middle of a thunderstorm. This is terrifying. The first thing, the wind starts to gust. Luckily, my cruiser was built to police specs and could handle this sort of thing, but the wind still rocked it on the suspension. Then the first large drops came. Their thud sounded like I was driving through a massive swarm of Wisconsin June bugs. I slowed to 20 mph as I entered the woods again and turned on the windshield wipers. They didn't help. It was like driving through a car wash. I started to worry. My windshield wipers were running at full power, but I couldn't see 10 feet in front of me. Then the lightning started. It was a continuous sequence of forks and strikes all around me in the forest. The sound of thunder was deafening. I couldn't go any further. I've been a police officer for 3 decades and have faced many scary situations. But sitting there alone in that forest was the worst thing I've ever experienced. The rain made vision impossible, and constant flashes of lightning and loud volleys of thunder illuminated the area with a nightmarish light. An atavistic feeling of horror came over me. It probably dates back to the times when we lived in caves. Back then we were the hunted, not the hunters, and the overhanging trees and pitch darkness hid many terrifying things. I quickly learned how truly prophetic this was. I once loved a woman, and I knew that she loved me. I met her when I was investigating her murder. Her murder? Well, this requires a little explanation. I was an enthusiastic and energetic sheriff detective, married to a smart and beautiful woman. Janet was everything you could want in a wife until she got involved in politics. They say that the government is corrupt. Well, my wife was a prime example of this. She got on a slippery path and never left it. I took part in the arrest. She received witness protection. I got a divorce. After that, I swore that I would never deal with these fickle creatures again. Then I came across Mavis. To tell the truth, I almost ran her over. This was definitely not a classic boy meets girl situation. I was driving through the Nicollet National Forest in the middle of the night. The situation was eerily similar to my current circumstances, except that it was just raining heavily and not the apocalypse. Mavis thought it was 1946, so naturally, I took her to the doctor to get her head checked. A local doctor confirmed that her attic was completely bat-free, and she did no things that the local historical society would be thrilled about. Plus, she dressed and acted accordingly. Of course, her story made no sense. That is, until I started digging deeper. After a couple of weeks, I learned a lot of interesting things. A woman named Mavis Pritchett actually disappeared in 1946. I subsequently learned that Felix Wynne alone killed her. How did I know this? Well, Wynne confessed to the crime. He did this when he was dying at the age of 95. Meeting the man you thought you killed 70 years ago can have such an effect on a guy's heart. The problem was that although Wynne was in his 90s, Mavis was a stunningly beautiful, black-haired, blue-eyed, freshly loved 25-year-old. This only added to her mystery. Having solved the murder, I was left with the question of what to do with Mavis. Let me describe it. She is smart, energetic, genuinely funny, brave, and deeply loving. She cooks like Julia Child and loves you like Mata Hari on meth. The latter happened every evening of our life together, so of course I married her. Oh yes, baby. Well, you see, we kind of conceived her at the beginning of our relationship. We were planning to get married anyway. So the arrival of little Ava was another blessing in a long series of wonderful events that happened to me. Then I spent 9 years living with a man who was so incredibly handsome and talented in everything that makes women the superior species that I thought my heart would burst with happiness. Instead, it crashed. There has always been the inconvenient fact that a man named Mavis was the victim of a murder in 1946. It couldn't be my Mavis. She was clothed in seductive flesh and was very much a part of the here and now. Therefore, I classified all other options in the alternative explanation required category. This continued until someone dug up a long-buried body. I hurried home to find an empty house. We used all available resources to investigate, but it was as if Mavis had disappeared from the face of the earth. Eventually, I accepted the fact that she was gone forever, so I held a memorial service for the body of a recently unearthed murder victim. Most people thought I was crazy. That is, except for 4 real friends. The grave is still there, on the hill next to the house. Above her stands a marble angel and a grieving husband. But life is march or die, and I was afraid to die. So I marched. My 9-year-old daughter saved me. It was the love and dedication I put into raising Ava that kept me on the rails. Ava makes me proud. At 21, she is an exact copy of her mother, a stunning young woman with a perfect body, honed by years of dancing, and a flawless face. In Mavis's case, such beauty was so mesmerizing that it drove the unstable man to murder. I'm still just the county sheriff. I am doing everything possible, but people never see me smile. That is, unless they're with me on that lonely hill when I'm talking to my wife. They would think I was crazy if they heard me, but I truly believe that I was there for her then. I was parked in the middle of the road, waiting for nature to get rid of the end of the world. My hazard lights advertised my presence. After a series of powerful lightning strikes, the sky above the trees flashed with ball lightning. What happened next is a little hazy. I remember the rain passing, as if someone had pulled back a curtain, and I looked down the rough gravel road to the bright sunny sky above my head. This was deeply unsettling, as the last time I saw this road it was paved and the sky was anything but calm. I started the cruiser, put it in gear and drove down the road. It took me almost an hour to reach the end of the forest. This was disconcerting in itself, since by my calculations the open area was no more than a mile away. The road was gravel until I got onto Wisconsin 73, which was now a narrow concrete road instead of a wide two-lane state road. Where have I been? I turned on the laptop to bring up the navigation program, but the browser was not connected to the internet. There was also no trace of that monster storm that had just passed over me. Was it mysterious? So I turned south and started driving down 73 into a bright Wisconsin morning. I felt like I slept the whole night instead of spending most of it dragging a drunk loser out of his squalid little house. My watch showed 8:45. I didn't remember the time I wasted, but I had to sleep during the storm. It was the only way to explain the loss of time. The fields were full of corn, and I saw farmers on vintage Ford tractors. There were no large combine harvesters or other farm equipment in sight that I was used to. Several people stopped to stare at the cruiser as I drove by. It was as if they had never seen a Crown Vic before. I parked and went to the hot spot for my morning cup of coffee. When I sat down, everyone except the waitress rushed to the window. I looked around. They must have remodeled this place, because it was furnished with chairs along the counter and tables, not booths. It looked like they were aiming for the diner style. The waitress came over. She was new since my last visit. She said, "How can I help you, Sheriff?" She noticed my uniform, badge and tool belt, Glock 19, extra ammo, pepper spray, handcuffs, and baton. I said, "Coffee and eggs." She turned to the girl who was standing behind the counter and said, "Pour the sheriff some coffee, Dot." I thought, interesting that the current owner's name is also Dot. The girl was very sweet and obviously smart. She took a cup from the stack and poured coffee from an ornate antique coffee pot. It was like the ones you see in old cartoons. This 1940s atmosphere was becoming stronger. The little girl asked, "What is that car you came in? Does it look like a P-51? I've never heard the humble old Crown Vic compared to a World War Roman II fighter." I said proudly, "It's a Ford Crown Victoria Police Interceptor with the Apprehender package. It can do 150 mph if I need it to." The girl's eyes widened. She said, excitedly, "Can I ride it?" She was very persistent. She had also apparently never heard of child predators. I said, "I'll take you for a ride if your mom lets you, but you should never get in a car with strangers." She turned to the waitress, who was obviously her mother, and screamed, "Mama, can I have a ride in the sheriff's car?" The waitress placed my eggs in front of me and said with irritation, "Stop bothering the man, Dot. We need you here." Then she turned to me and said, "That'll be 25 cents. It took me a second to translate this into Russian. I said, "You mean a full breakfast costs a quarter?" She said defensively, "We charge more because the food is all fresh." When I took the quarter out of my pocket, she said, "Wait a minute, what is this?" I said, "It's a quarter." She said, "No, that's not it. This is a quarter," and she showed me one of those old coins before they started minting states on the back. I took an old one out of my pocket and said, "Do you collect old coins?" when I handed it to her. The waitress said, "What are you talking about? This coin is this year." On her quarter was stamped the year 1946 under the head of Washington. I felt dizzy. I sat back down on the chair and asked, "What date is today?" The waitress looked at me like she thought I was kidding me and said, "Today is July 29th." I asked with growing concern, "What year?" She thought I was joking. She laughed loudly and said, "Last time I checked it was 1946. Isn't that right, Dot?" Dot smiled slyly and said, "No, I think it's 1846. The reality of my situation began to dawn on me. It was a real Dot. I last saw her a week ago. She was 82 years old. I hurriedly ate and left. Maybe one of the lightning strikes hit me. Maybe I had an aneurysm and was lying unconscious in the middle of the forest. Maybe I really was in the 1940s. Regardless, I was clearly not in Kansas anymore. I should have been terrified, but I'm a pragmatic person. The causes and consequences of my situation were unimportant to me. My only thought was that Mavis was still alive, and I could save her. I remembered every detail of the case. The murder occurred only 2 days later, on the 31st. Of course I had a problem. In 1946, Mavis Pritchett was a complete stranger to me. I'll decide this later. But first I needed to get rid of the cruiser. The last thing I needed was for people to ask me questions and for the cruiser to attract too much attention. More importantly, I needed money. I had a lot of 21st century money, but I would have ended up washing dishes in a diner if I hadn't found an old quarter. I could kill 2 birds with 1 stone by selling the Crown Vic. There was a garage in Fall Creek that had been in operation non-stop since the 1930s. The garage was there. It looked profitable and sold cars. I happily thought, the owner must love what I have to offer. I parked and opened the hood. 4 men rose from where they had been relaxing to come and stare. Then the man who was clearly the owner came out. They all looked puzzled. I expected my uniform and equipment to establish my credentials. The owner was a tall, thin guy in oil-stained overalls. He came up to me, not very friendly, and said, "How can I help you, Sheriff?" It was clear that none of them liked the police. I said in my friendliest tones, "I want to sell this beautiful car. The department no longer needs it, and I want someone local to benefit from it. For the right price, I will include guns and a special radio in the package." The owner looked skeptical. He said, "What is this thing anyway?" I said without blinking an eye, "It's a Lamborghini," although the blue oval clearly indicated that it was a Ford. I added convincingly, "It's an experimental vehicle. The government gave it to us. They made it from spare parts from one of their fighter planes." Dot gave me the idea. One of the onlookers said, "How fast is he going, Sheriff?" I replied, "It can go 150 mph on top, but you can drive it at 120 mph all day long." For all of them, the speed of most passenger planes was less than 200 miles per hour, so this was an unprecedented speed. It was obvious that the owner wanted it so much that his teeth were cramping. He said, "How much do you want for it?" It originally cost $56,000. I knew I had to bring that price down to 1940s levels. I said, "5,000. I might as well ask for 50 million. The owner shrugged his shoulders eloquently and began to walk away. I hastily added, "Okay, since you're local, I'll give you this beautiful car for 2,000 in cash, if you include that little beauty over there in the deal." I pointed to an immaculate blue 1940 Ford convertible. 2,000 was the annual salary in those days. But the guy's eyes lit up, as if he thought he had stolen the cruiser. We went to the Fall Creek Bank. The owner played with the guns mounted on the front seat all the time. I said irritably, "If you knock a hole in the roof, you'll still have to buy it." He asked, "What is this?" He pointed to the laptop between us. I replied, "It's an experimental radio that the government uses to track spies." In the 21st century world of electronic surveillance, this was not such an exaggeration. The owner took out $200 bills and handed me the money. We have returned. He handed me the title and the keys to the Ford. I handed him the keys and signed the title for the cruiser. I hoped he wouldn't notice the year it was made. Then we shook hands and I left. The first stage has been completed. I needed a place to stay, so I went back to Hotspot. Dot stood at the counter, polishing a soda glass. She asked, "What happened to your car?" I replied, "I traded it for something much cooler." I was getting used to the lingo of the 1940s. Dot looked at the small convertible parked outside with the top down and nodded approvingly. I said, "Are there any boarding houses nearby?" She replied, "Of course, Sheriff. My mom owns one. Would you like me to show you?" And she ran out from behind the counter, grabbed my hand, and dragged me outside. We walked up to one of those big, sturdy, stone, two-story colonial houses. You see them all over wealthy areas of Wisconsin. Dot dragged me inside without ceremony. Her mother took off her waiter's outfit and stood there in her house dress, with her hair tied up in a bandana. She was obviously cleaning. More importantly, she looked exactly like Eva Pedersen, the doctor's wife. Dot would soon look like her mother, whose name was Barbara, and Eve looked like Dot. So, apparently, Swedish beauty was inherited. Dot said cheerfully, "The sheriff needs a place to stay while he's in town." Dot's mom said, "You can rent a room full board for $5 a week. I know it's a lot, but I'm a good cook." I took out one of my $100 bills. She looked at me as if I had handed her a bag of gold doubloons. I said, "This is 5 months in advance, in case I need it." I thought to myself, damn, I need to change one of these $100 bills. Before I went looking for Mavis, I had one more thing to do: buy a toothbrush and some 1940s clothes. There was a men's clothing store on the main street. It was next to a hardware store and only 2 blocks from my new place, so I walked there. I've been to many clothing stores, but I've never been in one like this. Clothes were in drawers. There were none of the subtle marketing tricks, and the salesman followed you around recommending things. It also had wooden floors, a dusty smell, and the general appearance of a feed warehouse, rather than a place with fine men's accessories. The salesman was older, very smartly dressed, and had a polite demeanor by rural Wisconsin standards. He was having a friendly conversation with a guy of about 30 with dark hair and a narrow Clark Gable mustache over his lip. Both men were much smaller than me, but I've already noticed this about almost all the men I've dated so far. They assessed my uniform, and one guy extended his hand and said, "Welcome to our town, Sheriff. I'm William Morton, the town's doctor, and this is my friend Stanley Wilkes. Where are you from?" I shook his hand and shook it and said, "My county is very far from here. I'm just in town to sort out the details of a murder case." In fact, well, it was true. The county was 70 years in the future, and no murder would occur while I was here. I was aware of the irony. If I had prevented the murder, the Mavis I would have met 70 years later would be in her 90s. But I firmly believed that I was here for a reason, and the only one I could think of was to prevent what was about to happen in 2 days. I loved Mavis with every fiber of my being, so I didn't want her to be in any danger, regardless of the consequences for me. I gave a noncommittal smile and said, "My luggage got lost on the way here." Yet, of course, for 7 decades. I added, laughing, "I can't wear this uniform all the time, so I need some clothes to get me through. Just a couple of shirts and pants and other necessities." The doctor made comments while his friend helped me. People then didn't go to the doctor for every little thing. It was obvious that the doctor had a lot of free time. He said, "We're a nice little town. The people are really friendly. We haven't had a sheriff since Orville Hickenlooper died, and we really need one. When you get over your murder case, you should consider staying here. I know you'll like it here." I thought, if this isn't a dream, I might as well take him up on his offer. The total cost of 3 short-sleeve plaid shirts, a week's supply of boxer briefs, and 2 pairs of khakis was almost $24. I paid the seller with one of my $100 bills. He looked puzzled. The doctor said good-naturedly, "Why don't I take you to our bank and we'll change it for you?" So he escorted me down the street to the bank. The main thing I noticed about the bank was the lack of electronics. No atoms, no workstations, no screens at the cash registers, only ledgers and cash drawers. Another thing is the homely atmosphere of a small town. Everyone knew everyone, and there were a lot of jokes. It felt like a family restaurant rather than the sterile bank atmosphere I was used to. I changed the first $100 and got a lot of change for the other one. The doctor chatted all the way there and back about what a nice town we had. In fact, it was not much different from what it was in the next century. There were a few missing buildings and more open areas and alleys, but the general outline of the place was absolutely familiar. The clerk at the clothing store actually wrapped my purchases in paper and tied a string around them. I said, "Thank you," and carried them to the door when I came face to face with my fate. Mavis hurried down the street. She looked down and had an expression of some distress. The door of the clothing store opened straight onto the sidewalk, and I didn't see her coming. So when I went outside, I ran into her. I'm 6'2". She's 5 feet 2 inches. You can imagine who won this clash. I grabbed both her hands to prevent her from falling onto the street. Then I turned to face her. She looked into my eyes, and I felt a spark jump between us after 7 decades. She felt it too. She looked startled and also scared. I had an advantage. All Mavis saw was a big scary lawman wearing a smoky bear hat, with the tools of the trade strapped to his belt. But I lived with her as my beloved wife and mother of my child for almost 10 years. However, I couldn't just pull out a wedding album. It was too early. I formally said, "I beg your pardon, miss." She just stood there, looking at me with her mouth open, with those incredible blue eyes filled with a storm of emotions. I also started to worry. I loved her, and fate took her away from me. But I'm pragmatic enough to keep my cards close to my chest. My only goal was to get her back. I said, trying not to show my feelings in my voice, "I think we met somewhere, didn't we?" I resisted the urge to throw it over my shoulder and go to the nearest judge of the world. She shook herself like a dog, shedding water, and said uncertainty, "I don't think we know each other, Sheriff." It was obvious that she thought she knew me too, but I also thought it wise to keep my cards close to my chest. As soon as Mavis said that, some oily hunk with bow lips and a real Elvis haircut grabbed her arm and said, "What are you doing talking to that guy, Mavis? You're my girlfriend." The arrogance and possessiveness in his voice almost made me take out my baton. She said, "Don't go crazy. I was just chatting with the sheriff, Jimmy." Okay, maybe they would think our 21st century slang is weird too. He said, "Then you better prove it, otherwise I might find myself another girl." And he abruptly pulled her into his apartment. She looked at me with longing. At that moment, the doctor came out. He watched as they entered the apartment. He said, "This is Jimmy Rollins. He's a useless punk, but his parents have money. She's a beautiful girl. I don't know what she's doing with him. I guess everyone's tastes are different." Mavis appreciates strength in a man. Therefore, she tends to give preference to anyone who seems decisive. Jimmy Boy was an arrogant little rascal, so I understood why she was with him. Of course, I planned to change this state of affairs. I was just about to get into the car when I heard Mavis moaning from the wide-open windows of her apartment. Air conditioning was rare in the 40s, so of course they left the windows open. I thought, great, this is exactly what I needed to hear. At the moment, I had no right to it. Technically, I wasn't supposed to be born for another 27 years. But the sound of the love of my life performing a musical duet with another man nearly killed me. Dot woke me up at 7 a.m. the next morning. I slept like the dead in the cozy comfort of her mother's home. Dot said, "It's Tuesday and I have the day off, so you can take me for a ride in your car." I liked her courage. I said, "What does your mother say to this?" Dot laughed and said, "She thinks you're great. Maybe you'll be my other dad." I answered laughing, "Get out of here. You already have one." Her father was an old Swede whose English left much to be desired, but he clearly adored his daughter. I think all this unconditional attention is what made Dot so energetic. Breakfast was at Hot Spot. This was one of the advantages of living with them. Dot and I had just finished when Jimmy and Mavis came in and sat down at the next table. Dot walked over and joined them. She was excitedly telling Mavis about the day we had planned. Jimmy looked like he was embodying James Dean's character from Rebel without a cause. But in his case, the impression was more like Rebel without a clue. He was wearing a 1940s punk uniform, a white t-shirt with a Lucky Strike tutu tucked into one of the sleeves, a pair of old-fashioned heavy jeans, and motorcycle boots. His thick black hair was neatly styled in a greasy wave above his forehead. Fat slowly oozes from his nose. Mavis loves children. I already knew that. She was a fantastic mom, a nug world. She was talking animatedly to Dot, while looking at me longingly. She still looked confused. I didn't blame her. I was no better off than she was. Dot was chatting about her day when Fuckface decided it was time to be an asshole. He grabbed Mavis and spun her around in her chair. He said angrily, "Stop talking to that brat. You should be with me. I don't tolerate disrespect from my woman." Mavis has a short temper, and Dickbrit angered her. I thought, "Ooh." She shook off his hands and stood up. She said with rage in her voice, "Don't you dare talk to me like that. If you can't be a gentleman, then maybe I'll go with Dot and the sheriff." She then walked over to where I was standing, took my hand and said, "Can I ride with you too until Jimmy learns some manners?" Jimmy jumped to his feet and approached me threateningly. He was a short guy, maybe 5'6", maybe 140, like a rooster bunty. He said, "She's my girl, so lame, or I'll ruin you." He was talking to my chest. I had to laugh. This was unfortunate because it caused him to sway. I caught his fist in the air. It looked like a little girl. Then I slowly pushed him to the floor, onto his knees. He struggled to free his fist from my hand, calling me names that I didn't want Dot to hear. But my little friend clearly enjoyed every second of it. Mavis looked scared and completely excited. I said, "Mavis is a grown woman and a respected teacher in this community. She can do whatever she wants, and if she wants to go to Eau Claire with me and Dot, she can do that." Then I added in a threatening tone, "I am now going to let go of your hand and strongly advise you not to press this further. Needless to say, we'll talk again if you ever think about taking it out on Mavis." I twisted his arm sharply, just enough to cause him some pain. He screamed and then sat on the floor, clutching his wrist. The other visitors looked at me approvingly. Apparently, I wasn't the only person in town who thought Dickface was a pain in the ass. The three of us walked out of the hot spot and got into my shiny blue Ford. Mavis in the front, me and Dot in the back, leaning over the seat. Jimmy watched us from the steps of the diner. Jimmy yelled, "Get the bitch." I don't need that bitch anyway. I almost got out of the car, but Jimmy quickly ducked into the diner. I worked as a police officer for a long time. I knew we hadn't heard the latest from him yet. Tuesday, July 30th, was a beautiful sunny day in Wisconsin, so the top came down. Now that it was just me and Mavis, our past love began to work its mysterious magic. Couples in long-term marriages who manage to maintain something special have a deep connection that binds them together on some deep subconscious level. Mavis and I have had such a strong connection our entire married life. Now the future influences are present. Mavis stopped looking at me. Instead, she behaved like a woman, as if merging with me. We were just slightly touching physically, but our hearts beat together and our minds were on the same wavelength. Dot said from the back seat, I don't want to go to Eau Claire. This is too far, and you two are scaring me. I said cheerfully, Then how about a picnic? I looked at Mavis. She looked at me with a mixture of awe, lust, and confusion. I understand. The feelings were so strong that they had to come from somewhere, but she couldn't figure out where. I had an advantage. I knew that her future was our past. We bought some delicious snacks at the market. It was a small store, not a supermarket. Everything was amazingly fresh. I then drove us a little out of town to a place overlooking a mill pond. To get there, we had to cross a small stream. I helped Mavis over the rocks, and Dot jumped over them, as nimble as a little cat. Let's spread a blanket on the edge of the cliff. This is where our home will be in 7 decades. But now it was just a quiet place in the forest. I knew Mavis had had an epiphany. This was my goal. She loved her home and made it a happy place for almost 10 years. She continued to look at me with bewilderment. I should have explained everything to her. But what can you say? Hi, I'm your husband from the future, 70 years from now, and we're sitting in the place where our home will be. I know it sounds a little weird, but it's true, trust me. She'd run to the authorities, waving a personal protection order. So I just kept my cards close to my chest, waiting for the universe to decide what to do with us. The only thing I knew was that Mavis wouldn't get hurt. She was clearly happy to be with us. I watched as she chatted about ducks with Dot. Both looked at the mill pond, so I was able to get away with a sultry look. It hurt to be so close, but at the same time so far away. God, how I missed her. Then she and Dot, still laughing and chatting, began to walk up the small hill. There, a small willow tree with its characteristic drooping branches had just begun to sprout. The girls wanted to get a better look at the mill pond. I've seen the same scene hundreds of times, except that the little girl walking with Mavis was our daughter. I smiled, remembering it fondly. Then it dawned on me. She was going to stand in the place where I buried her. I jumped to my feet and was ready to shout, Mavis, when they arrived. She held Dot's hand. They turned to look at the stream full of wild birds. Then, suddenly, and without a word, Mavis collapsed like a balloon losing air. I rushed to her. Dot was on her knees, holding her hand and saying in an anguished tone, Mavis, Mavis. I picked her up and carried her back down the hill. This was the first time I had held her since I lost her. It was painful. Mavis came to her senses as soon as I carried her away from this place. She grabbed me, horrified. I could guess what happened, and I was at a loss for words. How can you tell someone that they stood on their own grave? I said, You'll be okay now, Mavis. It must have been something you ate. Absurd, yes, but what else could I tell her? She looked at me with her huge eyes and said, I felt as if I had stepped into the void. I was falling into oblivion. I said reassuringly, It was probably just low blood sugar. I've seen this before. I'm a cop, you know. Seriously? I sounded more like a politician. What I said should have satisfied her. I put her on the ground. She stood unsteadily on her feet. She took my hand again and laughed lightly. She said, I'm sorry I scared you both. Dot laughed and said, Thanks for the show. I've never seen anyone pass out before. Dot was a sassy little rascal, and I knew that in 70 years she would not lose an ounce of her sass. I said, Maybe I'd better take you home. Mavis nodded gratefully. We collected our things and walked back to the car. Mavis and I had spent enough time together that all the walls between us had fallen down, so returning to Main Street was an easy camaraderie. I dropped Dot off at the hot spot and continued on to Mavis's house. I saw Jimmy's face disappear from her apartment window as we pulled up. Mavis came out and walked around to my side. It was obvious that it was just as difficult for her to leave me as it was for me to leave her. But like I said, how do we start the conversation we're ultimately going to have? I awkwardly said, I hope we see each other again. She said enthusiastically, Oh, yes, Sheriff, I'd really like that. I said worriedly, if Jimmy gives you any trouble, I'm just 2 blocks away, at Barbara Hanson's house. She smiled sweetly and said, don't worry about Jimmy, Sheriff. I can handle him. He loves me too much to give me any trouble. Then she turned and slowly walked up the stairs. The memorable jiggle of her round, muscular buttocks reminded me of the endless nights of passion we shared. I knew she was too good for Jimmy. I also knew that we would meet him again. I handled this case like a normal police operation. In a sense, it was true. I was going to prevent a murder, so I needed to know every detail of the area. As a result, I spent the rest of the day and the next exploring the area. I was well aware that changing the course of events in the timeline, if I prevented Mavis's murder, would change a lot. Perhaps it was selfish of me, because there will inevitably be consequences. But everything that happened in the 21st century already happened in my timeline, so it was impossible to undo what happened. It was clear that the force that brought me to this point in time, which I assumed was the love we felt for each other, was influencing Mavis's attitude towards me. If that weren't the case, I'm sure she wouldn't have been so instantly attracted. After all, we had just met, and she did have a boyfriend. The guy turned out to be a problem. I didn't think Mavis loved him as much as she needed a man in her life. This was one of her special traits. She was not happy without a man to whom she could devote herself, and she was madly faithful to that lucky man, whoever he was. In my not-so-humble opinion, Jimmy was a non-entity. Over the years of working in the police, I have seen thousands of people like him. He was a weak, deceived, and selfish little man whose main advantage was that he had some money and, well, you get the idea. But the real culprit, as I already knew, was Felix Wynne. The last time I saw Wynne, he was lying dead cold in a nursing home. I knew he wouldn't look like the mummy he was back then, so I wanted to evaluate Wynne as a young man. But first I had to find it, and the internet wouldn't exist for another 50 years. So I had to make do with old-fashioned technology. They turned out to be surprisingly effective. I walked along Main Street to the phone booth at Lincoln and Lafayette. There was a pay phone inside. I haven't seen one of these since I was a kid. I didn't mean to call. I needed a telephone directory. He was surprisingly thin. Of course, there were only a few thousand people in the entire area, and most of them did not have telephones. I opened it and ran my fingers across the page to Wynne, Felix R. He lived on the west side of town, next to the railroad tracks. This was probably because it was an easy walk to the high school from there. I knew from 21st century cases that Wynne went crazy while he and Mavis were teaching there. Mavis is amazingly beautiful. She radiated such eroticism that could drive any man crazy. But most guys stick to the rules. Wynne didn't adhere. Wynne engaged in the kind of patting and groping that we would call sexual harassment. But guys in 1946 called it flirting. Either way, Mavis didn't like it and complained to the county. They didn't care. Until one day Wynne got mad and tried to take Mavis right on the teacher's desk. Mavis' cries for help attracted a crowd, and a pair of male teachers pulled Wynne away from her. The whole thing was so unbelievable and embarrassing for the district that they hushed up the matter and fired both of them. Was it fair? That's what they thought then. As a result, the man, clearly suffering from mental disorders, wandered around waiting for the next opportunity to attack the object of his obsession. This should have ended with Mavis being killed if I hadn't done something about it. I drove past Wynne's shack. It was made of weathered boards and appeared to consist of 2 rooms, with a toilet outside. It was still very hot outside. He sat on the porch in a tank top and pants with suspenders. I parked and walked up to him. He stood up suspiciously. He was taller than Jimmy, but the majority were, even then. He was apparently about 5 feet 8 inches and weighed about 180 pounds. He obviously considered himself a ladies' man, his thick black hair having been slicked back from his forehead with a large amount of what was then called hair tonic. It was mostly butter. Wynne had the same thin mustache as Doc. Clark Gable was still an icon among movie stars. He had small beady eyes next to a slightly too large nose and a thin evil lips. I put on my most innocent tourist face and said, "I'm lost, Mr. Do you know where Fall Creek is?" Wynne looked me up and down. He was an arrogant son of a bitch. But I was a helpless tourist, so I looked away as if I was scared. Wynne said, "Get off my property or I'll shoot you." I said, "Don't do that, buddy. I'm just looking for direction." Wynne stood up and headed into her shitty house. I knew he was going to come out with a shotgun. God help me, I was tempted. I could just shoot him right then and there and be done with it. I knew many places where a body could be buried, but I wanted to play it as close to what happened as possible. I just had to know. So I turned around and ran back to my car. Wind fired into the air, laughing. I started the Ford and quickly drove out onto the road and back into town. I saw my opponent and understood him. Now all that remained was to wait for the cards to be dealt. It was twilight, and I watched what was happening from my gas-filled car, parked in front of Mavis's apartment. I slumped in the seat. I've been a police officer for a very long time, and I know how to do surveillance with the best people. Nobody saw me. I haven't seen Mavis since the picnic, but I saw the dress. She came down the steps wearing the same outfit she was wearing when I met her in the future. She was clearly dressed in her best clothes. He was wearing a short wool skirt that showed off her fantastic legs, old-fashioned nylon shoes with a seam at the back, 3-inch heels, and a nice white blouse. The whole ensemble was completed with a stylish short wool jacket that matched her skirt. The weather told me she was wearing her only good outfit. This must have been back in the 80s, and the sun had long since set. Only a girl who dresses to impress would wear something like that in this heat. She stood under the street lamp in front of Doc's clinic, waiting for the bus to Cadott. It followed State 27 all the way to Cornell. The bus arrived. She came on board, and he left, turned right onto 27th, and walked slowly toward the eventual fate of Cadott and Mavis. I put the Ford in drive and followed her. They dropped Mavis off in front of the Crescent. This place still exists in the next century. It looked like an old barn converted into a bar. The only difference was the sign. It was lit by a single green light bulb in the shade, rather than modern neon. Mavis walked up the steps to the porch and entered. I parked and waited 15 minutes. There was a big party going on. People were moving around, and many of them were drunk. I remembered that it was a meeting for one of the locals. He had just returned from World War II. Mavis stood out from the fun. She sat sullenly at the table, looking depressed. Jimmy sat next to her, his hand resting possessively on the back of her chair. He smoked Lucky and chatted with all his friends. They both had drinks in front of them. I knew what was in Mavis's drink. I read the autopsy results. The presence of chloral hydrate was part of the matter. Looking around, I saw several things. Wynne was sitting at the bar, smoking and looking like a cat ready to pounce. Mavis's face was different. She had 2 bruises. I've heard that people actually see red when they lose their temper. I've never experienced this until then. My police brain was screaming at me to calm down because my mission was to prevent Mavis from being killed. But the part of me that loved my wife was already reaching out to Asp. Asp is 8 inches of a special metal alloy. It can be carried in your pocket. It opens with a flick of the wrist into a 2-foot club. The metal is formulated so that the tip of the baton is flexible, so you can swing it at almost supersonic speed. Therefore, the result of an Asp strike is similar to a shot. My emotions were too excited. I needed to get out of there before I did something stupid. I got up and ran out the door. As soon as I reached the parking lot, I leaned over and placed my hands on my knees. I took deep breaths, trying to regain my composure. After a while, my burning rage subsided, and I turned to go back inside. At that moment, I heard a mocking voice. "Are you too cowardly to fight me?" Mavis didn't respect me, So I beat her up and sold that bitch to Felix Wynn. Now it's your turn." I looked up at the smug, mocking face of Jimmy Rollins. He stood there, full of misguided self-confidence. He also had about 8 of his friends in a semicircle behind him. Friends contributed to his misguided feelings of self-confidence. I thought, a gift from heaven. This fool hit my wife and drugged her, and now I'm going to charge him. The thought of that bastard using his fists against Mavis's delicate flesh drove me crazy with rage. I said, trying to hide my enthusiasm in my voice, "Okay, kid, let's go." The fool actually assumed a Marquis of Queensberry stance, fists raised, left foot in front of the right. I didn't have time to dance around like Gentleman Jim, so I said in disgust, "Seriously?" and hit him in the groin. It was thoughtful of him to spread his legs so wide. This made the strike much more effective. I put all my pent-up rage into it, and it lifted Jimmy half a foot into the air. He let out a loud, strangled groan and doubled over. This was convenient because I didn't have to lift my knee as high to slam my face into it. Jimmy boy won't be as handsome or as virtuosic as before. He fell to the ground. The whole thing took maybe 5 seconds. I turned to his friends, grabbed Asp, spun him around with a flick of my wrist and said, "Who's the next one of these assholes?" The largest of them shouted, "This is not fair," and rushed at me. I'm an expert in handling Asp. You need to be one if you are in the police business, and I couldn't wait to get back to Mavis, so I knocked out his knee with one blow. I don't know how advanced orthopedic surgery was in the 1940s, but I'm sure they could have stitched at least some of the ligaments back together. I turned around, waved Asp, and shouted, "Anyone else willing?" The cowards ran away. Jimmy lay curled up on the ground, moaning loudly. He shit himself. The other guy cried like a little girl. I was only distracted for 20 minutes. But when I returned, I discovered to my absolute horror that Mavis was no longer sitting there. To make matters worse, Wynn wasn't there either. I found myself in difficult situations. None were worse than the day I lost Mavis. But that empty chair almost killed me. I muttered under my breath, "Not again," and rushed to his car. The only logical place was Wynn's house. I knew where he lived thanks to yesterday's visit. I didn't know how far ahead he was, but it didn't matter. I should have arrived shortly after the start of what he had planned. Wisconsin 27 has been paved, but is still very narrow. My trusty 1940 Ford had the classic Ford 239 flathead engine, so beloved by racers of the 1950s. I didn't know what Wynn was riding, but I was pretty sure I was faster. I drove about 18 of the 20 miles between Crescent and Wynn's house at 70 miles an hour. These were 1940s roads in a 1940s car. Faster, and I would have ended up in the trees. I was almost within the city limits when the car began to shake and vibrate. I instinctively slowed down. This was a wise decision because at that moment the right front tire blew out. I muttered under my breath, "Damn, damn, damn, damn," struggling with the car to get it to the side of the road. Some people might be sitting there banging their steering wheel in frustration, but I was in panic mode and the adrenaline was pumping. I was still about 3/4 of a mile from the point where 27 intersected with Main Street and then another mile back to Wynn's house. But yesterday's careful reconnaissance paid off. I knew that 27 enters the city at an angle. If I were driving a car, I would drive all the way to the intersection and then turn right to exit the city towards the house. But in a straight line through the forest and across the freshly plowed field, I was only 1/4 of a mile away. I jumped out of the car and ran through the trees, running as fast as I could. I jumped over Bridge Creek and found a trail in the surrounding brush that led me to the open fields around the high school. It was close to 11 p.m., but the moon was full and the night was cloudless in July. While running, I thought about the time. It's been an hour since I last saw Mavis. It would take some time for the substance to affect Mavis enough for Wynn to get her out of the bar. Win was in no hurry to get home because he didn't know anyone was following him and he had the whole night ahead of him. I thought he could be no more than 15 minutes ahead of me. I ran at full speed, crossing a farmer's field, aiming for Win's shack. I didn't have time for subtleties. There was only one door, and that was the front door. Win could be waiting behind her with a gun, but he didn't know I was coming. I also knew that he would be busy with other things. My blood was boiling, but I still found time to slow down, creep up to the porch, and quietly open the door. I heard whispers. They were in the bedroom. I crept in this direction. Asp was fully deployed. I heard Win say, smugly, "You're my woman now." This was followed by a sigh and the sound of a wet kiss. This was followed by a loud cry of pain and a slap. I knew Mavis bit him on the lip, and he hit her. She also used extremely obscene language to describe Win's dignity. Her voice was interrupted by the sound of gurgling. Win leaned back as he choked Mavis. I just walked to the foot of the bed. His position was wonderfully comfortable because it gave me a lot of his personal space to target. There was a characteristic crack as the tip of the asp reached supersonic speed, and the first blow landed right at the base of his groin. The impact sounded like a 9mm pistol hitting a watermelon. I knew Win wouldn't have sex for the rest of his life. Win screamed and flew into the air. He looked like a marlin trying to free himself from a fisherman's line. Win landed back on top of Mavis, who let out, "Ugh," and began to squirm, trying to catch her breath. The guy was completely weak when I grabbed him by his thick, greasy hair and pulled him away from my wife. I was going to tell him about all the creative things I was going to do with him, but I saw that it would be a waste of time. Felix Win was deader than a doornail. The pain must have been too much. Well, now all I had to do was get us out of there. I was confident that Win's death would be ruled natural causes. There were no visible signs of violence, and forensic science in 1946 would never have guessed that the purple mark between his legs was Asp's blow. So Win is dead and Jimmy Boy will be in the hospital for a very long time. Overall, a good day's work. I don't foresee any legal problems from Jimmy. This was rural Wisconsin in the 1940s, not the politically correct society of the 21st century. They would never prosecute a guy for being in a fight, especially if the fight was provoked by the injured party and 8 of his friends. I looked at Mavis. She was naked, squirming on the bed, still trying to catch her breath. Her body was just as incredible. I walked over to the bed and sat down on it. She shuddered to the side. I assumed the last thing she wanted was to be touched by a man. So I said softly, "You are safe now, Mavis. You will never get hurt again. You are my wife, and I promise to protect you with my life." She stopped squirming and started sobbing. It was pathetic. I said as humbly and respectfully as I could, "Can I give you a hug, just to comfort you? I'm not like that guy." She nodded pitifully and sat down. Wordlessly, she wrapped her arms around my neck and cried on my shoulder. I hugged her and just repeated over and over in my most soothing voice, "It's okay, my love. I'm here now, and I'll never leave you." She finally stopped crying. I said, "If you can walk, my car is right on the other side of the forest. If not, I'll carry you." She tried to get up and fell back again. I said, "Can I help you get dressed?" She nodded again. She didn't say a word at that moment. I carefully lifted her panties and dressed up her long, beautiful legs and over her ripe, round hips. She lay there without reaction. I helped her sit up and gently helped her put on her blouse, buttoning it past those juicy breasts. I did this without touching them. I put her flirty little coat on her. Then I put everything else, the pillbox hat, stockings, corset, bra, and shoes into a handy burlap bag. I picked up my wife and carried her out for the night. She clasped my neck with her right hand, and her head rested on my shoulder. She was light as a feather. I had forgotten how exquisite she was. The walk through fields and forest was amazing. I held her in my arms, thinking, Maybe I'm dead somewhere in the 21st century, but it doesn't matter. I'm alive here, and she's in my arms. I was happy for the first time since that catastrophic day next November, which was either a decade ago or 70 years in the future. God, it was confusing. I have already noticed one strange thing. When the cosmos was aligned, our relative ages were preserved. Mavis was 25 in 1946. I was closer to 52 in real time. But I returned to my 32-year-old self in this reality, and believe me, I felt the difference. As far as I know, I was as dead as Mavis when I met her. Or maybe it was just a happy dream from someone lying in a deep coma. But it didn't matter in the slightest. I was with her in living post-war America, and that was all I needed. It was like a complete reset for both of us. I opened the Ford passenger door and sat her down in the seat. Having closed the door, she immediately fell down, lying across the front panel. The fact that Mavis was still under the influence was a good sign. She may not remember much about what happened. I jacked up the car and changed the tire. My shirt was soaked from changing the tire, and I was exhausted. I couldn't take her back to Hanson's house, so I went to the only logical place, Mavis's apartment. I knew Jimmy would never go back there. I woke up to bright sunshine on August 1st. I fell asleep in Mavis's only comfortable chair. I was still wearing my short-sleeved plaid shirt and khakis. I looked across the room and saw a pair of serious eyes studying me from the bed. She sat, still wearing the clothes she had worn the day before. She said suspiciously, "Who are you?" I replied jokingly, "Your knight in shining armor, at your service, madam." Mavis looked annoyed and said, "No, who exactly are you?" It required tact, and I needed a buffer between last night and our future together. Mavis was alive and breathing, not lying in an unmarked grave in Nicollet, so we had our whole lives ahead of us. But the transition to this new life had to be carefully managed. Even without the last night of substances and sex, I knew the conversation would be amazing for both of us. I just couldn't lose her again. I didn't have morning coffee, so I easily said, "I never do anything that touches my brain until I've had my first cup of coffee. Let's go to the hot spot and we can talk there." She said, "I need to take a bath and wash all this off of me." She gestured down her body. I knew what she was talking about. I said, "I guess I should too. Why don't we meet there in an hour?" She smiled for the first time and said, "Breakfast is at your expense. You have a lot of explanations, young man." Her indomitable spirit has returned. An hour later, I was sitting at a table at the hot spot. I took a bath, as showers were rare in the 1940s except in the barracks. I shaved and changed into another one of my new shirts. I felt like a new person. I said to Dot, "Please bring 2 coffees here," and sat as far away from everyone else as possible. A few minutes later, Mavis came in. She was devastatingly beautiful and clearly annoyed. She wore a lightweight Betty and Veronica-style cashmere sweater with a pleated skirt, knee-length tights, and a pair of saddle boots. It highlighted her slender, beautiful legs and her stunning figure. She wore a loosely tied silk scarf around her neck. Mavis sat down in front of me. Dot placed a cup of coffee in front of her. Dot, being Dot, cheekily asked, "Did Jimmy do that to you?" Mavis's 2 bruises did not detract from her beauty in the least. Mavis laughed and said, "No, I crashed into the door like a clumsy person." Dot looked at me and said sincerely, "I hope you've evened the score. Sheriff, can you arrest him?" I laughed out loud and said, "I think he's in the hospital now, and he's not nearly as handsome as he was yesterday. Accidents happen, you know." This was also a test for Mavis. Before this, she lived and apparently slept with this guy. I was interested in how she would react to her lover's accident. Mavis looked blissful, as if she had suddenly realized that God actually existed, and said with considerable self-satisfaction, "Okay." Dot nodded decisively and laughed. It was clear that Jimmy didn't have many friends. I glanced at the menu and then looked up at a pair of blue eyes. They persistently peered into my brain. Mavis was a highly intelligent and very strong woman. Last night she was beaten, drugged, and had sex. Many women would be destroyed, unable to cope. Mavis wanted answers. I looked at her flawless face, every feature perfectly proportioned and aligned beneath her mass of curly black hair, and a feeling of relief washed over me. If I died, so be it. This was where I wanted to be. I said, "You graduated from Eau Claire Normal School and taught English literature in high school, so you must have read H.G. Wells, right?" Mavis looked at me in surprise. She said indignantly, "How do you know this? Are you delving into my personal life? I have rights, you know." This was the Mavis I loved. I laughed and said, "Relax, it's part of the story, but you'll have to open your mind. You know Wells, the time machine?" She nodded her head in agreement and said, "I gave this to my students to read." I said, "Do you believe something like this could happen?" She laughed and said, "This is stupid. Of course it can't happen. What are you getting at?" I felt that the conversation was not going the way I wanted. Mavis would probably get up and leave if I told her the real story. So I laughed and said, "I just wanted to know how open you are to new things." I knew how weak it sounded as soon as I said it. She said, threateningly like an inquisitor, "Last night you called me your wife." I saw that I couldn't avoid it. So he said, "Sorry, that was figurative. What I meant was my future wife." I smiled disarmingly and added, "I would have added the mother of my children, but I thought that would be too biased." She smiled back seductively and said, "Ooh, are you really that brave? What makes you think I would even waste time on you?" I looked at her with serious eyes and said, "You felt attracted. Hell, even Jimmy noticed it. I don't know what came over me, but I can't imagine my life without you." It was too far over the line, and there was too much sincerity in my words. Losing Mavis was so terrible that I couldn't even talk about it without my voice cracking with emotion. This bothered Mavis greatly. I quickly fell silent. Mavis said angrily, "How can you say that? I don't even know you." I jokingly said, "Maybe we were married in another life. Maybe this explains it." She fidgeted the way women do when their emotions are too intense. I was counting on the love we shared to lead this to its inevitable destination, but that clearly wasn't going to happen. She said with irritation in her voice, "I don't know who you are and why you are contacting me. But yes, I felt that something important happened between us." She was getting angrier by the second as she said, "I can't figure out what's causing this, and it's bothering me. I remember most of what happened last night, including the unwanted sex, and I know you saved me. But if you can't explain what you just said, you'll have to leave. Okay? It comes to cutting nuts." I tried my most persuasive voice. "Let's go somewhere alone. You won't believe what I tell you, but I'm counting on your trust in me in the past to help you trust me." We entered her small apartment. It was a cozy place. She had a living room with a couple of easy chairs, a table by the window with a small lamp on it, and a floor lamp next to one of the chairs. This was the chair in which I spent last night. On the floor lay a cheap but clean rug made of crocheted fabric. There were shelves of books in several bookcases in the corner. Mavis noticed where I was looking and said modestly, "I like to read." I knew this because she spent a lot of time in the library when we were married. There was a neatly made bed against the wall. There was another room, and it was the bathroom. It looked like Mavis was cooking on an electric stove. I sat down in one chair. She sat down in another. I noticed how neatly everything was laid out. There was no clutter, no pots on the small sink. Mavis was an excellent housekeeper, and it was clear that neatness was a deeply ingrained part of her personality. She looked at me carefully. The 2 bruises were alarming, but they did nothing to detract from her porcelain skin or the natural shape and deep intelligence of her eyes. Her thick black eyebrows were raised. She was waiting for me to tell my story. Well, as the British say, if you don't take risks, you don't drink champagne. I said, everything I'm going to tell you is true. I have no way of proving it. But I want you to trust your feelings. They will help you see that I'm telling the truth. I sighed and began. We were married for 9 years. We loved each other very much. We have a beautiful daughter named Ava. This is the only proof that this happened. I took my mobile phone out of my pocket. It was turned off. I needed to save battery power for just this moment. I saw that Mavis was about to explode. Then she got distracted by her phone. She looked puzzled. She said, "What is this?" I said, "This is my telephone. This is how we make telephone calls in the 21st century." Mavis let it pass her by. Then it dawned on her. She said, amazed, "Wait, you said 21st century?" She looked incredible. I said flippantly, "Shut your mouth, otherwise you'll catch a fly." As the phone booted up, a recent photo of Ava in her Badgers cheerleader uniform appeared on the screen. She was stunningly beautiful, exactly like her mother. Mavis said, stunned, "Where did you get that picture of me?" I said, "It's not you, it's our daughter Ava. She's 21 years old, and until 3 days ago, she was my only reminder of our life together." I said, "I know that your experience with men tells you that you would be foolish to trust me. But let me assure you, our love was real, and this young woman is the fruit of that love." Mavis looked like she was on sensory overload. This was understandable. Any normal person would react this way. I said pleadingly, "I'm risking my life and happiness on one roll of the dice, and I'll do anything to help you believe that I'm telling the truth." I added sadly, "But we're past the point that brought us together, so I will respect your decision if you choose to live your life without me." I looked at her, trying to convey my sincerity. I said, "I was a pretty good sheriff in this town in the future, and they've already offered me a temporary sheriff position. If I'm stuck in the 1940s, say, I'm going to take them up on the offer." Then I sat back and waited for her reaction. Mavis was a very strong and practical woman. When I first met her, she eventually accepted her new reality and dealt with it bravely. Many people would not be able to adapt. I counted on her sharp mind to accept that we loved each other in the future, even if my only evidence was a picture recorded on technology that she would never understand. So I sat there with my feelings open. The man around whom my life was built was a complete stranger, but we had loved each other once, and it was clear that the magic had worked again after decades. Mavis looked at me with a concentrated face. I said as kindly and gently as I could, "You just appeared out of nowhere one night. You thought it was August 1, 1946. I was the sheriff and took care of you while we tried to figure out who you were and where you came from." Mavis looked incredulous. I hastily continued. "We investigated, and eventually came to the conclusion that Felix Wynne killed you." Mavis looked absolutely stunned. She knew I was talking about last night. I added softly, "We closed the case, although the premise that you solved your own murder was insane." Mavis laughed. She said, "That's the most ridiculous story I've ever heard." I hurried to finish. I said, "By then we were very much in love and eventually got married. We conceived Ava before we got married, but time didn't matter." I could see Mavis was starting to get nervous again, so I pulled out my second best card. I said, "We led a happy life in our house. Do you know where it was?" She shook her head in denial, puzzled. She didn't understand why I even asked this question. I said with growing confidence, "That's where we had the picnic. I know you felt it." For the first time, Mavis looked at me as if she was beginning to believe me. I said, "After 9 years of wedded bliss, they dug up the body. You disappeared at that moment, leaving me and Ava to cope." Mavis looked even more thoughtful, so I played my trump card. I said, "I'm a simple guy and a practical man. I wasn't sure anything supernatural had happened. but I buried the body they dug up on my land. I added with a dark accent, "You were standing on your own grave when you fainted." Mavis looked startled. It was as if her perceptions at that moment had finally convinced her of the truth. This feeling overwhelmed her. Some women might cry. Some would have gone hysterical. Others might get angry. Mavis is wired differently. I discovered this the night she first realized her murder. She can be smart and practical, but Mavis is a deeply intuitive person. How she feels and how she reacts are her best indicators of the truth. She is not careless by any means. She just trusts her deep instincts. Essentially, Mavis listens to what her heart tells her. So it was almost inevitable that she would try to test what I had just said by doing what she did next. Mavis rose from her chair in all her confident feminine glory. She was very confident in her sexuality. She took my hand and wordlessly led me to the bed. She made me sit. The look she gave me was passionate. She sat down next to me and turned to face me, her lips just inches from mine. She said, breathing heavily, "Let's try a little experiment to find out if the funny story you just told me is true." Then she put one arm around my neck, grabbed the back of my head with the other, and we kissed for the first time in 10 years. It was like touching a live wire. A lightning bolt of emotion flashed through time and erased all the gloom of regret and unhappiness, and every hesitation. She pulled away, overwhelmed by the sensation. Then her eyes clouded with desire, and she pulled me back onto the bed. Her mouth opened wide in greeting. She made desperate little moans as her tongue sought mine. She began to crawl back, not letting go of me, until she was completely lying down on the bed. We were both dressed. I kissed her passionately while playing with one of her magnificent breasts. She moaned and thrashed. Then she smiled seductively and said, "This will probably kill me, but you need to make love to me now." Her skirt, panties, and sweater came off as if by magic. I've seen her gorgeous body with its firm curves and soft ridges many times over the years, but his revelation was still like watching a magnificent sunset. Maybe you've seen this a million times, but you'll never see enough. I assumed there would be a little foreplay. I especially wanted to stroke those round, full breasts. But she rolled me onto her as soon as we met again in our arms. It was all erotically motivating. But what made it so incredibly special was that I was making love to her. I did not ask to return to this place. I never could have imagined that this could happen. I missed Mavis for almost 11 long years. And now, call it fate or the last thoughts of a dying person. But, as incredible as it may sound, I made love to my dearly beloved departed wife. She then started screaming, "Ah, love me, Eric. Give it to me. It's been so long, I'm going to love you." She let out a final scream and collapsed onto the bed, exhausted. I finally came to my senses and took a little breath. My heart rate finally dropped below 200 and the goosebumps disappeared. I looked down at her beloved face. She lay beneath me, barely breathing, small shocks still running through her. Then it dawned on me. Mavis called me by name. She didn't know my name, only Sheriff. She slowly returned to me, making small sighs and moans. Finally, she opened those gorgeous eyes and looked at me. It was like dawn over the Garden of Eden. Her wonderfully deep and intelligent face captivated me. There was devotion in him. I couldn't even imagine an explanation for this. But this has happened before. Call it psychic, call it religious, call it illusion. But the first time we were together, fate gave Mavis a vision of her own death. It is clear that she was in a state of insane panic when she ran to my bed. After I calmed her down, we made love for the first time. I said in amazement, "You remembered." She said, "I don't remember many details, but I know that I loved you with all my heart and that our marriage was full of joy and satisfaction. More importantly, I know that I will always love you." Her face darkened as she said, "I was making Ava a snack before I picked her up from school. Then I felt dizzy and nauseous. It was like I was going to pass out. I remember feeling a huge amount of regret. Then there was just darkness. That reminded her. She screamed loudly and said, "Oh my God, what will happen to Ava? Will I ever see her again?" I tried to use the same explanation I used for myself. I said, "The future is our past, so this is 70 years from now. When I left, our little girl was a strong and capable young woman. I also noted that Ava has a whole town on her side, including the doctor and his wife, as well as the Jensens." I ended with, "She has a bright future in whatever timeline she's in. We might even live long enough to meet her. But for now, let's just spend our lives together." I accepted the city's offer. I was a sheriff there for many years, but that was 70 years in the future. Now I needed to provide for my wife and the child that was growing in her womb. Being a sheriff seemed like a great way to do that. I knew that I was a visitor in Mavis's time, just as she was in mine. I was also painfully aware that Mavis had disappeared the moment we dug up her murdered body. It was a classic paradox of existence. She couldn't be dead and alive at the same time, so the earlier state had an advantage over the later one. Now I find myself in the same situation. I knew that I would disappear the moment I was born, which would happen 27 years later. I never wanted to leave Mavis. I wanted to die in her arms. But my disappearance was predetermined. I couldn't be both a newborn and ready to retire, so my disappearance was inevitable. But I had a plan. It was a beautiful July day, and we watched a beautiful brown-haired girl eating ice cream. America has survived Korea, Joe McCarthy, the Vietnam War, the Flower Power Revolution, and Richard Nixon. It was the country's bicentennial, and the president was a former Michigan football player. Mavis and I were hanging out at the American Music Festival in Belleville. Locals called it Bamfest. This is an annual event, and there have been some pretty good blues performers, so college students from nearby Madison came in droves. Mavis was as beautiful as ever in her 56th year. The only thing 3 children did to her figure was increase her breast size, and she still had those slender legs and firm buttocks. But her glory lay in her stunning face, which remained wrinkle-free. I nodded towards a young guy in his 20s. He made his way through the crowd. He looked unsure and awkward, as if he thought he didn't belong here. He was a handsome guy, tall and muscular, obviously a farmer and not a college student. Mavis squeezed my hand lovingly. Then she walked towards him. She tugged at his sleeve and said seductively, "Could you show me where the food trucks are?" She put a lot of her legendary charm into the request. The guy started pointing, then took a good look at the woman who asked the question. Mavis was old enough to be his mother, but no mother has ever looked like Mavis. The guy had the best idea. He said enthusiastically, "I'll take you there." Well, it was worth going out of your way a little if you could spend time with such a wonderful woman. When they left, Mavis turned to me and winked. Meanwhile, the girl finished her ice cream and walked away towards the parking lot. Apparently, she was looking for her friends. And so, the guy did not bump into the girl. The girl didn't spill her ice cream. There was no apology. There was no instant attraction. There was no dating. There was no marriage. And I was never born. Ava Jensen walked into the hot spot. She was starting her tour with Joffrey the following week, and it was her last day in town. For a 21-year-old from Wisconsin, making it in the big world of professional dance was rare. But she worked hard to achieve this and believed in her destiny. Ava knew she was adopted. The Jensens had no children, but they raised and loved Ava as their own, and Penny Jensen's wisdom and support created the beautiful, intelligent, and outstanding person Ava has become today. Dot, the octogenarian owner of the hot spot, sat in a booth in the back. There was a much older lady with her. This woman was about 90 years old, but the shadow of its rare beauty still remained, like the ruins of a particularly elegant and graceful ancient temple. Ava thought briefly, "I bet my birth mother looked like her." Ava came to the Jensens very early. She had no memory of her biological parents or the circumstances that led her to the Jensens, but sometimes it seemed to her that she had experienced two completely different childhoods. The old woman's name was Mavis. It was one of those old-fashioned girl names. Mavis was the wife of the former county sheriff for 70 years. Her husband just died. Their marriage served as a beacon of hope for people who still believed that lifelong romance was possible. Mavis and her husband were very rich. The sheriff had an extraordinary ability to invest in previously unheard-of businesses that then became legendary corporations, such as IBM, McDonald's, Microsoft, and Apple. It was almost as if he could see the future. However, despite all their wealth, the sheriff and Mavis lived their entire lives in this modest little town. They raised their children here and always treated Ava like one of her own children. Ava was special to Mavis. It was as if she was her surrogate great-granddaughter. So Ava wasn't surprised when Mavis waved her over to the table. Mavis said, "Before you leave town, child, there is something I need to tell you." The old woman was physically fragile, but she still had those commanding, blue eyes, radiating an indestructible spirit. Mavis struggled out of her seat, and her driver helped her out to the car. Ava sat down next to her. The drive to the sheriff's vast estate was silent. Mavis seemed to be formulating her thoughts. The estate occupied the entire height outside the city. The house itself was a replica of a classic Victorian mansion, although it was actually only 30 years old. The expansive lawn was bright green and immaculately manicured. Somewhere, under the hot July sun, a lawnmower was working, and Ava could smell the smell of freshly cut grass. A small stream flowed past the base of the house. Above it was an elegant iron bridge. But instead of walking towards the house, the old woman turned and walked along the immaculately manicured cedar path towards a secluded grove at the top of a small hill above the mill pond. The two women sat on a marble bench next to the sheriff's grave. A huge willow tree enveloped the entire space with its characteristic branches. The air was filled with the noise of insects, birdsong, and a light summer breeze. Mavis looked towards the monumental tombstone. A soft and loving expression appeared on her face. The tombstone was engraved with the names of the sheriff and herself. The only thing left to add was the date of Mavis's death. They sat there for a minute, Mavis looking old and frail. Ava was slender and energetic, like a big cat. Mavis was at the end of her life. Ava was just entering her prime. Ava's face was exquisite, with black hair and blue eyes. Her outstanding body was honed through hours of rigorous dance training. However, there was something immeasurably similar between them. The old lady turned to Ava and fixed her gaze on her with a serious, almost pleading look. It was as if Mavis wanted to convey something very important. Mavis said with deep sincerity, "Fate brought me and the sheriff together, and I know that fate will bring us together again. I pray for this every day of my life." She sighed and said with relief, "It won't have to wait very long." Then the old woman fell silent. She took both of Ava's beautiful, slender hands in hers. Mavis's hands were stained with age. She said, "Fate is fickle, and sometimes its twists and turns are hard to understand or accept. But you can't change how the cards are dealt, so you have to play them as best you can. That's what your father and I did to you back then, and that's all we expect from you now. We're very rich, and we love you very much, so you'll be provided for the rest of your life. I just wanted you to know that before I go." Ava screamed. She always felt it. It was impossible to explain why, but Ava knew it was all true, and she was amazed at the miracle of it all. Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one.